friends, family. This is the International Forum to Address Racism Across the Globe. And what you will see is an assortment of dynamic leaders from literally throughout the world that will present for us their views on the moment we're in and also where we're going. Huh? So just as a bit of framing, this issue of race, we all know this has been a momentous season from the horrific killing of our brother George Floyd to what we see as the devastating impacts of the COVID crisis disproportionately impacting our communities. And we see it is throughout the world that our communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, are facing disproportionately the deaths from COVID, but also the economic disruptions from COVID, job losses, loss of businesses, loss of livelihoods across the globe. And we also know that at the forefront of this moment are incredible activists. Some have taken on formal leadership roles, others have taken on leadership of movements, but there is this awakening that is changing literally the globe as we speak. And so we're coming together to talk about this, to create a space, thanks to all of our colleagues at Rainbow Push for having the vision to bring together this incredible panel. So what we will do is to give them opportunity to share their reflections on this moment we're in, but to also encourage a conversation about where we're going. We know that this is a time where many are saying build back better, and others are saying we need to not build back, but build forward. Because looking back, the injustices have been baked in. And how do we begin to emerge from this COVID catastrophe, understanding that there will be future pandemics, understanding that climate change has disproportionately impacted our communities, and we need a change. We need a change. Could reparations be a part of that change? What's happening in places around the globe? How do we begin to envision a better way to live and realize the dreams of our ancestors? So let's begin. We're going to start first with Lord Simon Woolley, who is director and co-founder of Operation Black Vote, a national and internationally renowned racial equity organization. He was elected in April of this year, just a few months ago, as the principal of the Homerton College, Cambridge University, the first Black person to hold this post at either Oxford or Cambridge. His resume is quite intense. Please, Lord Woolley,
Thank you.
time to
Thank you.
share your reflections on this moment and
Thank
also
you, Chair.
what you see.
And I am I'm deeply honored and humbled to be along a distinguished panel. And I would say, Chair, particularly at this time in our historic moment in history, that we come together to have, I would argue, potentially the biggest and greatest conversation that we can have in regards to the past and how it's still influencing the present. And you mentioned what Diane and I describe as a double global pandemic that occurred last year. The first one was COVID-19, and as you said, the way that it laid bare the already structural racial fault lines and exacerbated them. You know, this time last year when we were watching our screens and seeing doctors and nurses dying, 97% were Black and brown. Cleaners, porters, security guards. A minister said to me in the chamber that he thought COVID-19 was a racist disease. And I replied to him, nothing could be further from the truth. What this disease has done is laid bare racialized areas, low pay, poor housing, inequality in health. If you follow the disease, you'll see structural racism at its worst. That was one end of the pandemic. The other was watching a man die in front of our eyes. And we knew, everybody in this panel knew, Black people around the world knew, it wasn't just the knee that killed George Floyd, it was the American system. And that was the worst effects of a white supremacist system. And not just in the USA, but also in the UK too. So as a result, we had the greatest civil rights protests ever, actually, in terms of numbers, in terms of length of time, in which young people, a bit like the civil rights movement in the 60s, Black and white, predominantly Black-led, said, we want the greatest conversation that this country's ever had. To look at these institutions that were built in the times of the enslavement of Africans and the stealing of the colonization of our lands, the systems that were built then and had to justify murder and rape and everything else by dehumanizing us, those systems are still there now. And they're still delivering those outcomes. And I think that a lot of people began to see life, albeit a glimpse, through our lens and wanted to do something about it. So there was great conversations in businesses around the world. And we thought, well, Diane and I thought, well, we're onto something new now because people are wanting to think about structural racism. And then the backlash. And that was already coming before this, but now it's come as a tidal wave. And we've had a report just a few months ago that says structural racism doesn't exist. It says that because footballers are taking the knee, we're not dealing with, they call it white working class. So now they're framing the debate, if you deal with structural racism, you're against poor white people. We're in a war zone for this conversation. It should be the greatest conversation. It's turning into the nastiest conversation. We need to sow a golden global thread through activists and actors, because your struggle is mine and mine is yours. And you know, when I hear Europe, and I'll finish here, when I hear that Europe is having a debate on whether slavery is a crime against humanity, I see white privilege right there. That it should even be debated is deeply troubling and problematic for me. But I'm pleased we're here because it means the struggle continues.
Without a doubt, a luta continua, and you bring to mind the framing of Ubuntu. I am because you are because I am. What happens to one impacts all. So yes, there's so much there to unpack in terms of this war zone that we're currently facing. Maybe we stay in the UK and we move to the phenomenal Diane Abbott. Many of you know her well. She is the first Black woman ever elected to the British Parliament. She is the longest serving parliamentarian, represents the Labour Party in so many powerful ways through the shadow Secretary of Health, shadow Secretary of Development. She's done a lot, but she is representing Hackney North, and we're so honored that she is here with us. So maybe we stay in the UK and hear your reflections and see how you see this war zone evolving and reactions as we push back against the climate of structural racism.
Thank you very much, Amira. It's a tremendous privilege to be at this important international forum. And I would want to associate myself with the remarks of my parliamentary colleague and long-standing friend, Lord Simon Woolley. We are at a moment when it comes to institutional racism. And given how much that is thrown at us, it's sometimes easy to get bogged down in our difficulties, our trials and tribulations. But we struggle and sometimes we win. And I think it's important to register both. This meeting has a global perspective. I welcome that. But you'll forgive me if I focus for just a few minutes on one country, the United States, because so many of us internationally were horrified by the treatment of Black people and other people of color in the United States, but we've also been inspired to the resistance to those attacks. And I want to register a great triumph, looking at it from across the Atlantic in the UK. It's been a great triumph. It's the triumph of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one person who will not be at all happy with events in the past year in the United States is the ex-president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump was defeated fair and square at the polls. Black Lives Matter played a very important role in that. And Joe Biden is now president of the United States. So we struggle, but we can also win. But just to say a few words about the fight against racism here in Britain. To understand racism in Britain, to understand where it's come from and where it's going, I think there are three things you have to reflect on. One is the history of the British Empire. The other is the ongoing history of British colonialism. And the third, which has already been mentioned, is Brexit. The British Empire was, in its time, I think, one of the biggest territorial empires in the world. It was the empire, as the British like to boast, on which the sun never set. And it was built on a literature and a culture of white nationalism and white superiority. And sadly, although we've moved on since the height of the British Empire, some of that thinking has not been quite left behind. There were so many writers and so many poets who wrote at the height of empire. Kipling, some of you may have heard of, and it was Kipling who spoke about the lesser breeds without the law, meaning people of color internationally. And sadly, as I say, that type of thinking, we haven't entirely moved on from that. Our empire was followed by colonialism. And my parents were born and brought up in a former British colony, the Caribbean island of Jamaica. And the relationship between its former colonies and Britain, particularly since the Second World War, has shaped issues around race. And the British, having gone overseas to other people's countries to build an empire, former citizens of the empire and the Commonwealth are now in Britain and actually helping to make this country not just a more diverse place, but a richer place. However, although there's a lot of positive thinking and welcome for the new diverse Britain we see in 2021, you still see a certain amount of resistance, and that is rooted in the thinking and the ideas of colonialism. And of course, most recently, we've seen Brexit. Now, Brexit, I think, must be the biggest act of self-harm of the British nation. And it's an act of self-harm, which, sad to say, is based in thinking about racial superiority. And for Britain to have done this harm to itself, to be causing the problems it's causing because of Brexit, is very sad indeed. So as we go forward, what is required? First of all, it is required never to forget our history, the history of empire, and how, to an extent, we're still trammeled by it. It's important to understand that colonialism was not a positive experience for many of Britain's former colonies, although many of the people in those colonies have a great deal of affection and support for the British. And we also have to move beyond some of the self-harming notions of racial superiority which characterize Brexit. So we have to understand the past in order to move beyond the past. We have to, I hope in Britain, have the same sort of victory over Boris Johnson as you had in America over Donald Trump. And I think if we can have that political victory and continue to make those cultural advances in understanding, and finally, if we understand that the fight against racism is a global struggle, I believe that in all our lifetimes, we can continue to see the progress on fighting racism that we need to see, not just for our generation's benefit, but for the benefit of generations still to come. Thank you very much.
So, with that, I think we're going to next move to the US. We hopefully will come back to Sweden, but let's move to the US. And because, you can't mention the right wing and mainstreaming their discourse, unfortunately, without remembering January 6th in the US, when there was a quite blatant and flagrant coup attempt by the right wing in the US, rooted in racist white supremacist thinking ideology driven by the former president, who many of us don't even like to call his name. But maybe we shift to the US across the Atlantic, and we have our colleague who is an MSNBC contributor. She comes with an incredible background, having lived not only in the US, but in Switzerland, in Canada, and really throughout the world. So maybe we come to you next for your reflections on this moment that we're in, where you see the achievements, but also the challenges, and the work that you see that's needed for us to realize the dreams of our ancestors.
First of all, thank you so much for that introduction, and to Rainbow Push Coalition, thank you for putting on this magnificent panel. I am chair of the board of Rainbow Push, but I do also have another hat where I am president of the National Bar Association, which is the largest and oldest bar association of people of color, primarily of African descent, in the world. We have over 66,000 lawyers. So my perspective really comes from my platform this year. As president of the National Bar Association, we tackled 3 pandemics, COVID-19, voter suppression, as well as police brutality, which is front and center here in the United States. When we talk about what happened on January 6th, I put that in the category of the voter suppression pandemic that we're confronting here, because no sooner than the victory in Georgia, where I'm living now, the Georgia Senate runoff elections on January 5th, where historically Reverend Raphael Warnock became the US Senator from Georgia with John Ossoff. Not even 24 hours later, we saw the attempted coup d'etat, and I'm so happy that you characterize it as an attempted coup d'etat, because that's what it was. This notion of a protest, people just, complaining, no, it was an attempted coup d'etat, an attempted takeover of the United States government that was brought upon or incited by the former president. And that is a key distinction. That has not happened in this country since the 1800s. So for people who are downplaying the significance of what happened on January 6th of 2021, they are sorely mistaken at what actually happened. If you want to talk about where the right wing in this country and where white supremacists are in this country and what their intentions are in this country, all you have to do is look back at January 6th of 2021 and you will get your answer. So they are alive and well. Since that time, since the swearing in of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, we have seen in this country over 30 states that have either implemented into law voter suppression laws that were designed to prevent, preclude, or stall or oppress people's right to vote. And might I just say, usually Black and brown people. It's not just any old people, it's Black and brown people, because in their view, in the right wing's view, the Black and brown people are the ones primarily responsible for putting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris into office. And by the way, they're right. It was primarily Black and brown people in this country that made a difference, and young people. And when I say Black and brown people, that means African Americans, people of African descent. That means the Latinx community. That means Asian Americans, and that means young folks. Because after all, when we saw in this country people protesting because of George Floyd's heinous murder, what we saw were people of all shades and colors marching hand in hand, just like Reverend Jackson said, we should, a real rainbow push coalition marching for justice, marching against police brutality, and marching in favor of Black Lives Mattering. So when we think of what's happening in this country, racism in some respects, and racial disparities are at an all-time high, there is a measure of justice that we saw in the verdict of Derek Chauvin. But that measure of justice was an important measure of justice because we saw the perfect aligning of an attorney general, by the way, one of my members, Keith Ellison, a star-studded group of prosecutors, one of my members, Jerry Blackwell as well, and others who tried that case to perfection. A climate in that city, in Minneapolis, and jurors willing to take that bold step, because in the context of police brutality cases, that verdict reflected a bold step, and to call truth to power and to let justice reign. And despite the criticism, despite the protests from the right-wing organizations and those who threatened to kill many who supported a verdict against Derek Chauvin, that jury did what it felt was best and where the evidence led it. But what people need to understand globally is that is not the DNA of how police brutality cases go in the United States. That is how they should go. That is what should be the result when the evidence supports it, but that's not how it happens. So that was a measure of justice. We hope that it continues, but we have to remember here we are fighting on a daily basis voter suppression. Reverend Jackson has been fighting voter suppression since before the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act was designed to give Black and brown people the right to vote, because even though women in this country on the books had the right to vote generations before then, Black women and women of color did not have the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That is critical because that underscores how in this country you can have a law on the books, but it's not reflected in reality, just like the emancipation of the slaves. It took 2 years before, and that's why we celebrate Juneteenth, before there was the actual implementation of freedom in this country. Just as we have a lot of things in this country where on the books of law say one thing and practice something else happens. So from my view, to answer the question, where are we? We have a fight ahead of us. In Portuguese, a luta continua. Vitória es certa, but la luta continua. The struggle continues here for racial harmony, for racial equity, for racial justice, for social justice. And we have to fight every single day because we live amidst pandemics that are not medical pandemics. COVID-19 just underscored the disparity. A disparity, by the way, that we knew before. George Floyd's death underscored a disparity that in our community we've seen forever. We've never seen a time when Black men and Black women weren't killed, weren't murdered at the hands of law enforcement. What happened was mainstream America saw the murder thanks to a 17-year-old soldier, an angel, who videotaped that, because I dare say, had she not videotaped that and had her mother not allowed that to go viral, the outcome could have been different in terms of mainstream America seeing it in living color. But there are thousands of Breonna Taylors, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery's out there, thousands of them. And I'm proud to say that our National Bar Association members have been the advocates of many of them and are on the front lines of that fight on the high profile cases and the low profile cases. You know, you see Ben Crump on those cases and Daryl Parks and Lee Merritt and Lanita Baker and so many other, Chris Stewart, but we've been fighting that fight for a long time.
Well, we thank you for fighting that fight. We thank you for holding up as a collective a vision of true justice that goes beyond what's written in the law, but making sure there's true justice. And we just thank you for all of your leadership. We're going to come back to you because we know there's a lot you have to share. But let us, if we can, and you touched on it as well, right? That this has got to be a rainbow struggle, as Reverend Jackson and Rainbow Push team, so well capture that it's got to be a rainbow of peoples, of communities, of families coming together to fight injustice. And we want to touch on another kind of horrific expression of this white supremacist and racist ideology that's emerging, and in terms of the attacks on particularly the Asian and Asian Pacific communities in the US and around the world. And we wondered if we could maybe shift to the phenomenal Reverend Dr. Grace Ji-sun Kim, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, but she does so much. Asian Christianity in the Diaspora is a series that she edits. She is a phenomenal leader and thinker, hosting a podcast on Christian Century, and just so much that she does. So if we can turn to you to share your reflections on this moment of incredible pain, but also a moment of some victories. And so where do you see it from your lens? And what is your sort of call to action for those who are joining us today, wanting to carry forward the dreams of our ancestors?
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here and to listen to all the other fabulous panelists. So thank you so much for making this a rainbow panel. I just wanted to say I received my PhD at the University of Toronto, but I teach at Earlham School of Religion, which is in Richmond, Indiana. So to share a little bit about the Asian hate crimes that is happening, I think from the last March 2020 till now, a new organization formed, which is Stop AAPI Hate. And they are taking and recording the number of hate crimes that have been committed against the AAPI community. And I think that the last year, it's been over 4,000 hate crimes committed. And some of those are verbal, physical, and murder. And I think when we look at the statistics, we are alarmed that this many hate crimes could have happened, but we also know that Asian Americans live with the honor shame system, and some of us do not want to report what has happened to us because of the shame that falls on us and our family and the rest of our community. So we know that the hate crimes are higher than what is being reported. We have witnessed some of those hate crimes by videotape and security camera tapes that have been shared on social media and on the news. But we must be aware that even though there is this high number of hate crimes committed, this is not new to our Asian American community. We came in the 1600s, and then the bulk of our immigration started in 1800s. And when we came, we were working as indentured workers. Some went to Hawaii and worked in the sugarcane. Some worked on the railroad here, and many of us died working on the railroad. There were white workers and there were Asian American workers. The white workers were paid a lot more than the Asian American workers. The white workers were given food as they worked. Asian Americans were not given food. So out of the measly amount of pay that they got, they had to pay for food. And also the dangerous work of dynamite, blowing things up, was performed by Asian Americans. So many Asian Americans died. And when we think about the immigration, in 1882, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first act of stopping and banning any racialized group from coming into the United States. So in 1882, because of the racism, discrimination, and xenophobia against Chinese, they had passed that law, and it was supposed to be in place for only 10 years. And it kept getting renewed and renewed and renewed. So during that time, it wasn't just against the Chinese. Anyone that looked like Chinese were also barred and prevented and withheld from owning property and etc. So there was a lot of hate already against Asian Americans during that time. And Asian Americans, with the 14th Amendment, if you were born here, you can become citizen. That was not allowed against the Chinese. So there were all these restrictions placed against the Chinese during that time. They had to carry papers. If they left the country, it was hard for them to come back into the country. So during that time, they had no voting. Chinese couldn't vote. Asian Americans couldn't vote till 1943. So that's a very recent time in our own history. And not every Asian Americans were allowed to vote since 1943. It was a slow inclusion. 1946, I think the Indian Americans were allowed to vote, and slowly the other Asian Americans were allowed to vote. So this is a very recent part of our history, and we have to remember that the hate that has happened against Asian Americans is not a new phenomena. We need to stop the hate. We need to stop the discrimination, the xenophobia, and the marginalization. And I know, with all this crime against people of color, America was built on the labor of people of color as they brought Africans and made them enslaved. And then we think of the genocide of the Native Americans here on this soil, where a bulk of the Native Americans were slaughtered. And, when we think about sports and we have Redskins, there's a large movement to get rid of racial terms such as redskin that comes from the genocide of the Native Americans. They had to, white people who murdered and killed Native Americans, they had to show their bodies to get paid. Then they complained that the bodies were too heavy, so they said, bring heads only. And after the heads were shown, then they said, that's too heavy. So they said, bring just a scalp and you'll be paid. So that's where the Redskins come from. And I think these racialized terms should be eliminated. When we think of the Latinx community, we took a bulk of Mexican land, and what still is happening in the border with the Mexico and the US border, these are hate crimes and hate and racism against people of color. So we need to be aware of all our history and our present time today. So many African Americans were lynched, but one of the biggest lynching that happened was against the Chinese community in LA around 1917, where reports are different. 18 or 19 people were murdered at that time. And that's 10% of the Asian population in that LA area. So we have to remember our past so that we don't repeat what has happened, all these hate crimes against people of color and the discrimination that happens. And so now during the pandemic, I can't ever forget what happened in the Atlanta area, where the young man went to the 3 spas and murdered 8 people on March 16. That will be forever ingrained. And that just shows you the hate crime that is committed against people of color. It took a while for people to say that that was a hate crime, but to us in the AAPI community, of course it was a hate crime. Witnesses have said that he wanted to kill all Asian Americans. He had hatred towards Asian Americans. He had visited those spas and he knew who were working there and who went there. So it was a targeted hate crime. And so when we think about these murders and many of the AAPI hate crimes that are committed from the pandemic are towards women and the elderly. These have been caught on camera. And we think about, people think that they can commit these crimes because they can get away with it, targeting the vulnerable women and targeting the elderly. The elderly have been stomped on, pushed, and yelled at. And during these scuffles, many elderly have died. So it is very painful for me to be part of this community, that it's happening to my own brothers and sisters. It's happening to younger kids too. My 2 of my kids, well, one of them now is in college. So when I think about the hate crimes that are also happening on campus, it brings tears to my eyes. And we know it's not just happening to the Asian American community, it's happening to all people of color. I must also emphasize, in the 1960s, white sociologists had come up with the term model minority, and they used it against all of us as people of color. So they said, for Asian Americans, if only they called us the model minority. So they used it against African Americans, the Native Americans, and Latinx, saying, oh, only if you worked as hard, you would be successful as the Asian Americans. But we know that's only a myth. There's so many Asian Americans. If you just visit Flushing, New York, so many living in poverty. And we know that not all Asian Americans are doing well in society. So that term created by white sociologists is a form of white supremacy. It was used to pit us Asian Americans against other people of color. And white people continue to use that term. And we Asian Americans continue to fight against that term, because what it does is it breaks us and it makes us be angry with one another. And that's not what we should be doing. We need to be in solidarity with one another. We need each other's help to fight against the racism, the discrimination, the xenophobia that happens here on American soil. So we need to be in solidarity and stand with our African American sisters and brothers, Latinx, and Native Americans, and all people of color. So I'm grateful for the work of Rainbow Push and Reverend Jackson. I know he recently went to celebrate Asian Americans and African American solidarity and remembering George Floyd and Vincent Chan, the murder of these two innocent people. So I'm grateful that we can continue to work together and be in solidarity and fight white supremacy and any crime committed against people of color, not just here in the US, but around the world. So thank you so much.
And I think what we have to acknowledge, as you all have said, we've come a long ways. Our ancestors did fight to end the scourge of apartheid. Our ancestors did fight to end the scourge of Jim Crow. Our ancestors did fight to end the slave trade and the horrors of slavery. So we come to activism today on that history, standing rooted in the courage and the boldness that they lived, and carrying that forward for future generations to continue this fight, continue this struggle. So yes, there are no perfect institutions, but each of you have chosen a path to shape the institutions where you can, whether it's the church or the parliament or the courts or the people's minds through film, right? Each of you have chosen a path to challenge the status quo, to demand justice for our people, and to raise your voice to make sure that the world lives up to the necessity to honor the dignity of all human. So we thank you for all that you do. We thank Rainbow Push for understanding the power of the rainbow, bringing together a coalition of leaders around the world that are rooted in their own struggle, but understanding that this is a global struggle for justice and dignity. And so we we thank you for your time. We thank those who have joined us virtually across this media. We ask you to continue to stay engaged. We encourage you to reach out to the leaders that are part of this panel today through Twitter, through all the social media platforms. But we also encourage you to be a firm member of the movements for change, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Rainbow Push. These movements are at the vanguard of the change that the world needs. So join them, join us, continue, as Attorney Hoffler said, a luta continua, right? We will continue the struggle, and we will go so much further because of each of you. Thank you for your leadership, thank you for your boldness, and thank you for your time today.